Hi there, for people who are starting to join us, welcome to the webinar. Just bear with us a few moments, just going to wait for people to join and then we'll start in a few minutes. Hi everyone, we're just waiting a few minutes for everyone to join and then we'll start. Hi, thanks for joining everyone. We'll just give it one more minute, see if anyone else joins us and then we'll kick off. Okay, what do you think, Jan and Charlotte? Should we kick off? Yeah.
Ready if you are.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I am Helen. I'm from Lloyds Bank Foundation and I'm our Events and Communications Officer. So I'm joined this morning by Jan Golding, the CEO of Roots HR, who will start the webinar shortly, and Charlotte Badgett, the Consultancy Services Manager, who will be managing any questions you have throughout the webinar. So Roots HR are a social enterprise providing HR advice, support and consultancy for social sector employers. This webinar is funded from the Social Impact Fund created from the trading surplus, and we would like to say thank you to Jan and Charlotte for taking the time to deliver this for us today. We've been working with Roots HR to develop this webinar as a lot of what we've heard from charities since all this began. Our fantastic regional managers have been in touch with the charities over the past few weeks, and key themes have emerged, with HR being one of the themes that emerged the strongest. So as a result, we wanted to provide an opportunity for charities to ask questions relevant to HR issues you're currently facing during this crisis. So I'll shortly hand over to Jan and Charlotte, but just a bit of housekeeping. Your microphones are all muted so there's no background noise. If you do have any questions as we go through, please use the Q&A box at the bottom. You should see that highlighted as you scroll towards the bottom of the screen. Charlotte and Jan will go through these towards the end of the webinar. There's also a chat function. Some of you have already been introducing yourself, so thanks for that, but feel free to do that. And then if you have any comments, post them in there as well. Also just wanted to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and we'll also share it with you afterwards, and we'll be popping it on our website so you can refer back to it as well. I hope you find this an enjoyable and useful session. Please get involved by posting questions and to Jan and Charlotte, and I'll pass over to Jan. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad that you can join us. Welcome to this webinar. I'm going to be talking about managing your workforce through the COVID-19 pandemic. So to start off with, this is what I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to be having a look at paying people, some different categories of people. We're getting a lot of questions here in Roots HR about that at the moment. And I haven't got it on the agenda actually, but we are going to be talking about how to keep your business going through the pandemic with managing your workforce while we've got the pandemic ongoing. And we're also going to be talking about home working and the cultural shift to home working for people that haven't done it before. I will spend quite a lot of time talking about furlough leave, because we are getting lots and lots of questions about furlough leave, and of course that's the great hope for people at the moment, is that they'll be able to save businesses that might otherwise have gone under, because actually we can use furlough leave to carry on paying staff costs. So we'll be talking about that as well. And there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So please message your questions to Charlotte using the chat function. What I'm going to say to start off with is that the Chancellor announced a whole load of measures other than just furlough leave, other than just the coronavirus job retention scheme, when we went, as we came towards lockdown 2 or 3 weeks ago. So there was a whole package around things like deferring VAT and income tax. There were things around statutory sick pay relief for small and medium-sized businesses. There's a 12-month business rates holiday. There is business grants, business loans, different types of funding for different types of organisation, a new lending facility from the Bank of England to support liquidity. And there's also an interruption loan scheme as well. And since then, the Chancellor has also announced some £750 million of money for the not-for-profit sector, for charities. I'm not sure yet how people are accessing that. I don't know any detail about that. Purpose of reminding you of that is that we're seeing lots of organisations come through to us who are jumping into making decisions about their workforces when actually they haven't necessarily looked at the impact of the whole overall package on their cash flow and their business position. And we'd certainly say to people, don't furlough anybody, certainly don't make anybody redundant until you've had the opportunity to think through everything that the package can offer your organisation at this point in time. It's important that you understand what's available to you, because the position might not be as bad as you might otherwise think. So I'm going to start by talking about paying people. We've been very busy at Roots HR since lockdown. We're always quite busy, but we're even busier now. And one of the main types of question we're getting is about how people should be paid in the circumstances. So I'm going to start off by talking about sickness. Importantly, employees need to follow the government advice if they have got symptoms of coronavirus. And I would suggest that you as the employer would direct them to the government advice and that people would follow that very, very closely indeed. What they're entitled to if they are off work sick with symptoms of coronavirus is they're entitled to statutory sick pay at least for 14 days from day one of their sickness. It's important that for coronavirus purposes, you know that statutory sick pay is payable from day one, because for other types of sickness, it is still payable from day 4. There's still a waiting period, but there's no waiting period for sickness related to coronavirus. Now you can claim that statutory sick pay back from the government. I'm not quite sure how that scheme is working yet, but there will be some government advice on how to do it, and you can claim that SSP back from day one. In order to qualify, they have to have earned an average of £118 over the previous 8 weeks. If you're calculating this, do go and look at the government's definition of how to calculate 8 weeks, because actually it's not quite straightforward as just going back 8 weeks. There is a start day and a finish day for the 8-week window that you need to know about. So go and have a look at that. But if they have averaged £118 per week, then this SSP is £94.25 per week for those people. We'll talk more about furlough leave in a minute, but just to say that you can't claim SSP for somebody who is on furlough. If they're sick, they need to be paid at sick pay. And if they're on furlough leave, they can be paid at furlough leave, but they can't get 2 grants or two government pieces of money at the same time. If somebody is off sick and you have got a contract of employment, a policy that provides for a greater level of sickness pay than just statutory sick pay, then you will need to pay that to them while they're off sick. That's not altered or relaxed or changed in any way, shape or form, so people will need to be paid as per their contract of employment in those circumstances. Moving on to talk about people who are self-isolating or self-shielding, the government has extended its definition of the purpose of statutory sick pay, of a statutory sick pay payment for people, to include people who are self-isolating or self-shielding, even if they themselves are not unwell. So from the government's perspective, for qualifying for statutory sick pay for the coronavirus scheme, where you can get SSP from day one and where the employer can claim back the first 14 days of that, then it extends to people who are self-isolating or self-shielding, who don't have any symptoms. So that's very different to your contract of employment, because it's unlikely that your contract of employment will extend to cover people who are not actually sick. So if you've got sick pay in your contract of employment, if you've got it in a policy, it's unlikely that it will cover people who are self-isolating or self-shielding, but who don't have any symptoms. It's then your choice as to whether or not you extend your contract of employment to cover those people. You don't have to do that. It would be a voluntary thing, and some bigger organisations that I'm aware of are doing that. They're saying, well, if the government is allowing SSP for people who are self-isolating or self-shielding, we will pay our contractual sick pay scheme in those situations. We're not coming across many small organisations that are in a position to do that, affordability-wise. I don't want you to think that that's what everybody's doing. In the event that people are self-isolating, self-shielding, you do not have to pay your contractual sick pay unless you choose to do it. Okay. If they are required to stay at home because they're self-shielding or because they're self-isolating, they can get an isolation note by visiting NHS 111 online, and that means they don't then have to go to a doctor. As employers, you're being asked to take a more relaxed view about whether or not you require a sick note from people, a fit note from people in these circumstances. So you don't have to insist that they present a note to you, but you may choose to, and I can see circumstances in which you would want to ask people to provide you with that note. If they get that note from NHS 111 online, it's called an isolation note, and it is a replacement for the fit note that the GP would give them if they're not well enough to come to work in normal circumstances. Let's move on to talk about people with caring responsibilities. I've kind of framed that as parents who are homeschooling at the moment, but of course there are people who are at home with caring responsibilities during the coronavirus pandemic and who can't come to work for those reasons. And it's not only just parents who are homeschooling. But normally speaking, somebody who can't come to work because they need time off suddenly, unexpectedly, to care for other people would be entitled to have unpaid leave for dependents. And in normal circumstances, that would be interpreted as up to about 48 hours to deal with the emergency as it presents itself. It's not intended usually to be time off to actually do the caring yourself. It's intended to be time off to find another form of caring. The problem, of course, at the moment is, particularly with parents with children, whereas you might ordinarily ask the grandparents to have them, you certainly can't do that at the moment. And you're unlikely to be able to find, childcare is always in demand, isn't it? You'll be unlikely to find immediate childcare to be able to still carry on coming to work in current circumstances. So unpaid leave for dependents in these circumstances, in these unusual circumstances, needs to be thought of as an extended position for people that have got caring responsibilities, can't leave those responsibilities, but also then therefore can't come to work. It's unlikely in those circumstances that you will have, well, some people will, a little bit of pay in the contract of employment. So some contracts of employment will, or there might be a leave policy that says that for the first day or for the first 2 days, we'll pay, or we'll pay half pay or something. There might well be some sort of contractual requirement to make a little payment, but obviously it's not going to come anywhere near the amount of time that people are actually going to need to be away for in the current circumstances. If you have had to send people home during the crisis because you've got no work for them, or because your business is closed, you've had to close your business, perhaps you would have work because there's demand, but actually you've had to shut your business, then there is no statutory payment for that, but people are entitled to their full pay. Furlough leave has a big role to play in these circumstances, and we'll come on to talk about that in a second. But as a principle, the starting principle in employment law is that if you've got a contract of employment, you have to offer work, and the individual has to come to work and do that work. And so if you need to send them home, it has to be on full pay. But don't get too upset about that, because we're going to be talking about furlough leave in a second. I just wanted to talk briefly for a moment about an unusual clause in people's contracts of employment. Not everybody will have this, and some of you may have exercised it before, but for those of you that do, if you've got a layoff or a short-time working clause, sometimes known as LOST as an acronym, as an abbreviation, in your contract of employment, some people may have exercised this before we found out about furlough leave, before where they were taking action early, before we went into full lockdown. I just want to explain a little bit about what this is, because I don't think all employers know exactly what layoff and short-time working actually gives as to employees in law. It might be useful for putting into contracts of employment when you're updating them in the future in view of this. But for some of you who have exercised this clause already, you may just want to know what you've got yourself into. So if you have got this in your contract of employment and you have therefore decided already to lay off and some employees, or put them on short-time working, laying people off means sending them home without work, and short-time working means reducing their hours and only paying them for those hours. In law, short-time working has a definition of being 50% or less of normal working time. This has got its origins in the 1970s in manufacturing, but the idea would be that when the order book is light, the order book in inverted commas here, when the order book is light, the employer has the right to send either people home or to put them on to short-time working. Now, that's important when there's if there's a clause in the contract of employment. It's important that you know that you don't have to agree it with people. You can just do it. It's not implied. It's never implied in a contract. So if it's expressly written into the contract, then that's something that you can do in those circumstances. If you haven't got it in, you would have to seek to agree it with people at that point in time. In the event that you have got this clause in and you've already exercised it, be aware that an employee on short-time working is entitled to a statutory guaranteed payment of what was £29 per day up to the 6th of April, but is now £30 per day from the 6th of April. On the days that they're not working, they're only entitled to receive that for 5 days in a rolling 3-month period, and you can't claim it back from the government. Their annual leave will be carrying on accruing during this period of time. So you've got 2 immediate costs that you must be able to fund if you have put people on layoff and short-time working. One of those is an annual leave, and one of those is the statutory guaranteed payment. If an employee on short-time working for 4 consecutive weeks or 6 weeks in a rolling 13-week period writes to you, they are entitled to resign and treat themselves as though they are dismissed on grounds of redundancy and entitled to statutory redundancy payment. So you may not know that you set this clock ticking when you put them on layoff or short-time working. They have to have over 2 years to claim the redundancy payment. They have to have over 2 years of service, but if they do, that's what they can do. So if they write to you within 7 days of either the end of the 4-week period or the rolling 13-week period to say they intend to claim a redundancy payment, you've got a week to write back to them, only a week. And in that week, you have to say that you're going back to normal working hours within 4 weeks, and that you'll then sustain those for 13 weeks, and then they're not entitled to a redundancy payment. If you don't do anything, if you don't reply, then they've got 3 weeks after that to resign and claim a redundancy payment from you at the statutory level, statutory redundancy. I wanted to make sure that you're aware of that, because I think a lot of people have these clauses and don't realise that that's what's involved in them. So I'm going to move on now to talking about keeping your business going during these times. With all of the reasons why people can't come to work, as well as the physical constraints and the financial implications of lockdown, it will be pretty hard for some organisations out there to be keeping going at the moment, even if the market is still there for you. But your charity is a business, and you'll appreciate that you want to keep it going as far as you possibly can. How you do that is going to be different for each business, and everyone will have by now worked through the initial business continuity issues that faced you. And either you'll be continuing in a different way, or you'll have closed part of your or all of your organisation. I'm going to talk a bit more on a separate slide about home working, but some of you will still be delivering services and will no doubt be in a position to carry on delivering those services, especially if you're in health and social care, for example, looking after vulnerable people. Now, there's guidance from the government, if you're in that marketplace, that you will have seen about looking after workers who are facing the public, who are going in and out of homes of vulnerable people through this crisis. But in summary and at a high level, you will want to have updated all of your operational risk assessments to reflect the increased risk to staff. So things like infection control, use of PPE, that's personal protective equipment, lone working, and anything else that's relevant to your particular organisation. But most importantly, you'll want to have updated those risk assessments and brought in any new measures to mitigate the new and different risks that are coming into force at this particular time. You will no doubt be seeking to keep people off the roads and off of public transport and any other areas that might be crowded if you possibly can. And you'll be trying to find other ways for them to work without travelling or without travelling in busy places. You'll need to train your staff or to brief them, and that's not going to be easy if they don't come together in the way that they used to in an office location. But you'll ideally have done that in writing or by Zoom or by telephone, by conference call. You'll have trained or briefed your staff on how to use any new PPE that's required of them, or any work processes that you need them to use or do differently as a result of the current circumstances, especially anything that is designed to keep them healthy and safe, because the last thing you want to do is your neglect to cause ill health or worse to any of your staff. And you'll want to have trained or briefed your managers to manage workforces who are now in many cases not office-based or based in the same location, or who perhaps are newly remote working. You need to think, or managers need to think about what communication with workforce is required. Get managers to spend time on the how are you when they're talking to employees. Everyone's in a new, different environment in some way now, and get managers to understand that and to remember that if people are still working, they'll have a very different domestic scenario going on behind the scenes than the one they used to be, the routine they used to have. So brief your managers to listen to a team member's own situation, to understand it and to show some empathy. And remember, they don't have to solve people's problems, but actually acknowledging them and recognising them, that for them, their home situation is very different to how it used to be, is an important part of supporting them to be at work. And then think as well about whether people have got the tools to do this. Have you got enough mobile phones, for example? Have you had to order new ones of those? You may need to look at your expenses policy and think about whether or not you need to offer or alter that at the moment, and whether maybe to offer people some sort of compensation for using their own mobile phone in the circumstances when they're working for you, if you haven't got equipment that you can immediately give to them, and they're having to get through until extra supplies come. You also need to think about the impact of remote working or home working on data protection. Think about the data that people now have to access in their vehicles or in the home environment or in other people's home environments that previously they could only access at work. Think about that and the systems that they're now able to access that data through. What unwelcome exposure might that data now have in the worst case scenarios? No one has relaxed GDPR through this period of time, so the expectation around the protection of data is just as great as it's always been. And we will talk a bit more actually about data protection on the next slide, about on home working. And then just think about annual leave here as well. A lot of people will have annual leave booked now around the Easter period, and they'll be then talking to you about whether or not you still want them to take that annual leave. Well, my starting point is, if people have got annual leave, you want them, and they've requested it, you want them to take that annual leave if you can possibly accommodate it, because you need to get annual leave used up. There is the new working time coronavirus regs 2020, which came in last week, and which provide for people to carry forward up to 4 weeks of annual leave for up to 2 years if they can't take it because of coronavirus related reasons. That's nothing to do with furlough leave. That's if they can't take it because they are too busy working for you at this point in time. But you may not be in a situation where that applies to you. If somebody says, can they cancel or postpone annual leave? Can they, if they request to change it because they want to take it after the lockdown period, they want to save their annual leave for a nice holiday later in the year, that's all right if you want to accommodate it, but you don't have to. If they've requested annual leave and you still want them to take annual leave, then that annual leave can go ahead if you want them to use it up. And you can cancel or postpone annual leave in the circumstances because of operational reasons if you need to as well. Obviously try and do that with care, where people have got reasons to be on annual leave. You wouldn't do it if you didn't have to. Annual leave is an area that we're going to have increasing numbers of questions about, I think, particularly as we go through the Easter period. So moving on to talk about home working for a moment, and for perhaps managers who've never managed home working workforces before. We have been talking to organisations that are very nervous, or have been very nervous, about how this is going to go. Are people actually really going to work? Are they just going to be looking after the children or digging the garden or whatever? It's important as a starting point that you demonstrate trust. It's really important that you lead from the top on this, and that you act as though you trust everybody to be doing their work. Now, what's important, of course, is that people have meaningful work to do, and meaningful work may well have changed quite a lot as a definition in these times compared to how it, to what it meant when people were in the normal office environment. I've got a friend at the moment who's just started a new job, and she hasn't really got into that job and been given her objectives yet, and she is sitting at home frustrated and anxious and worried, and having very little contact with her line manager at the moment. And what she needs is meaningful work. If somebody actually had a phone call with her, and I've told her to ask for this, had a phone call with her, she asked for, what can I be doing at the moment that is constructive? So be giving people, be remembering that people need to have work that is relevant, useful. If you haven't got normal work to give people at the moment, think about those projects that you've always got shelved or put to one side. What is it that people can be doing at the moment that is actually useful work that will benefit your organisation in the longer run? So demonstrate trust in people, give people work to do, encourage structure, particularly for people that are new to home working. Encourage the working day to have some structure to it. So for example, maybe have a Zoom check-in with your team where everybody logs on to Zoom. A Zoom subscription, a paid for Zoom subscription, if you haven't worked this bit out yet, is £12 per month. And it's money well spent at a time like this. Get everybody to log on and say hello, good morning, as though they were coming into the office at 8:30, for example, in the morning, if you want to. We do that some days at Roots HR, and it works lovely for us. Encourage people that need to have a meeting by phone to perhaps do so mid-morning, and just to exchange an email with the person they're having a meeting with and say, let's both grab a coffee and a biscuit before we do that. So you've got a virtual coffee meeting then going on. That just makes it a bit nicer than just a telephone call. Encourage people to take their lunch breaks and to perhaps do their daily exercise, go out for half an hour at lunchtime with a family member, and have a walk in the nice sunshine that we've got at the moment. The same thing with a phone call mid-afternoon. Again, if you've got to have a meeting, let's make it a meeting where you've got a cup of tea and a slice of cake on the go at the same time. And make sure that there's a degree of social discussion in these meetings as well, in these phone calls. Just make sure that you're doing the how are you, how is it for you. I think everybody is doing that to a larger extent, talking about how different their lives are and what it means to them, but encourage that to happen, and try and get people to finish their work at their normal time or the scheduled time. I am aware that lots of people have changed their working days in order to accommodate perhaps their child's schooling or their partner's work as well. So actually what used to be the normal working day might not be the normal working day anymore. But encourage people to start what is their agreed working day now at the right time and to finish it at the right time as well. There is nothing to be gained from people feeling like they haven't done enough work to justify walking away from the computer for the day. Again, giving people good objectives, giving people meaningful work will all help with that, particularly if you break it down into what might be expected to be done in the first day and what might be expected to be done by the end of the first week, those sorts of things. Other examples of things that organisations are doing, sending around things like desk exercises, stretches, quizzes, competitions. I heard of one organisation that's having a crackerjack session, which is a 5 o'clock on Friday night session where they all get together on Zoom. The whole organisation does this and they all log on with a beer or a glass of wine or something at 5 o'clock on a Friday. You could do it today, actually. You could have an early crackerjack session because lots of people are breaking up for Easter today, aren't they? And I would be reminding managers to look for individual situations. Who might be lonely, who lives on their own, who do you need to do an extra check-in on, who's got very difficult home circumstances at the moment, who might be stressed, and tailor check-ins accordingly. And where you can, try and take the work pressure at least away from those people, even if you can't change, and you shouldn't be changing the home situation for them. That's not something you can do. Just talking about data protection in the home environment a bit more. We touched on it in the previous slide. Again, I can't encourage you enough to think about what data is being used by individuals in their home environment and what the worst case risks to you might be. Might people be downloading it onto their home computers because they've got a better broadband connection that way, or because it's easier to handle that way? Have some written rules in place about what can be done with data and what's not allowed to be done with data, and talk those through with people at this point in time. Talk to people about the working environment they're in and the sort of work that is suitable. I was giving advice by Zoom to a client earlier this week, and she was sitting in her dining room with no headset on, so people around her could hear what she was saying and what I was saying to her. And I could see straight into her lounge where her husband and her teenage children were, and she was discussing by name with me a colleague who she line manages who's about to fail their probation period. Now, we could have had that call with the kids in their bedroom or with the husband out on daily exercise. It could have been done differently. And that's the sort of a good example of a situation where you want to really help people to think through about how they're using their home environments and protecting data and confidentiality at the same time. I'm going to move on now to talk about furlough leave. So this is the leave that is paid under the coronavirus job retention scheme. This is money for employers to continue paying part of employee salaries for employees who would otherwise be laid off. It's important that everybody understands this is for employees who would otherwise be laid off. All businesses are eligible, and you were told from the outset to designate affected employees as furloughed workers, so to identify who you needed to furlough and to notify employees of the fact that they're now furloughed. And the government made the comment at the time that changing the status of employees remains subject to existing employment law, and depending on the employment contract might be down to negotiation. That means unless you've got a layoff or short-time working clause in your contract, you can't just take away somebody's work from them. Never mind their salary, we'll come on to that, but you can't just take away their work because you are under the contract of employment. You are in a situation where you have mutuality of obligation. You have to offer them work and they have to perform it. And so to take that away has to be done by consent, by agreement. Where employees are furloughed, HMRC are paying up to, they're paying 80% of the furloughed workers' wage costs up to a cap of £2,500 per month. You can fund the other 20% if you want to. You're told that if you need money to keep you going until the grant comes through, and we know that there's a portal being built by HMRC for the purpose of this, and it won't be ready until the end of April, you may be eligible for a coronavirus business interruption loan or some other form of grant. There's grants coming from the local authorities just to help with cash flow. One of the key features of furlough leave is that the employees placed on furlough can't undertake any work for you. We will talk in a minute about the fact that they can do some training and some volunteer work. We'll talk about that. But they can't do any service delivery work for you, and they can't do any income generating work for you while they're furloughed. And what you're doing with them, they remain your employee throughout the whole period of furlough. So things like annual leave accrue and all their ordinary employment rights still exist. And what you're doing is you're varying their contract of employment. You're seeking to agree to vary their contract of employment in order that you can take away their work and that you can pay them 80% or 100% of salary, depending upon what you want to do. We've got a furlough leave contract variation document in Roots HR. So if you want a copy of that, you're welcome to email Charlotte at hello@rootshr.org.uk, and we'll get that sent out to you. That's hello@rootshr.org.uk if you want a furlough leave contract variation after this. Just to say as well, before I go on to the next slide and we talk in more detail about this, the government's intending for the coronavirus job retention scheme to last for at least 3 months. So it came in on the 1st of March and it will finish therefore currently on the 31st of May unless they decide to extend it. So it's important to understand. I was talking to somebody yesterday who's talking about bringing somebody back from maternity leave and putting them on furlough. And actually the individual hasn't given notice they want to come back from maternity leave. And if they did, it would have to be 56 days notice. And I think that probably takes us probably beyond the 31st of May anyway. So it would serve no purpose in those circumstances. So let's have a look at who's eligible. So employees working reduced hours or for reduced pay are not eligible to be furloughed. People that are currently on short-time working or just working or in any way, shape or form cannot be paid furlough leave. You can't get the grant for them. They must not be going to do any service delivery work or any income generating work for you. To be furloughed, they must have been on your PAYE payroll on the 28th of February this year, 2020. They can be on any type of contract. So that can be full-time, part-time, fixed term, 0 hours, casual, as long as they were employed or on that PAYE payroll on or before the 28th of February 2020. You can include seasonal workers. So if you've got people that you had on the payroll over the Christmas holiday and you haven't taken them off for some reason, they might not have been working through January, February, but if they're still sitting on your payroll and you were going to use them at Easter time and they worked last Easter, then you would be able to furlough those people. Foreign nationals are eligible, so that's been clarified recently. And remember that employees who are furloughed have the same rights as they did previously to things like statutory sick pay, maternity, parental rights, rights against unfair dismissal, right to a redundancy payment if you have to make them redundant at the end. If they are minimum wage, so national living wage or national minimum wage, they are eligible and they can receive 80% of that living or minimum wage. So i.e. they would be receiving less than the minimum wage, but they're not working. So you haven't got to worry about the situation in which you have people working for less than national minimum wage. So you can furlough them on 80% of what their wage would be if they were working. I'm going to talk about training in a second because that's relevant for those people. And again, apprentices are also eligible. Again, you pay them 80%, or you can pay them 80% of their apprentice wage. I'm not going to go into lots of detail on how to calculate the grant on this call, But there is a government website. If you haven't seen it yet, it's www.gov.uk/guidance/claim for wage costs through the coronavirus job retention scheme. If you put that into Google, claim for wage costs through the coronavirus job retention scheme, the latest government information on the situation will come up, and very helpful it is too, to some extent. Furlough income is subject to tax and NI in the normal way, so you're going to be working with gross figures. That means that the maximum gross salary that someone's going to be getting in order to get the £2,500 per month is going to be £3,125. For most people, you will use their actual salary if they're on a normal annual salary. That's what you'll use to calculate how the 80% of the grant. But for workers on variable hours, you are allowed to use the higher of the average monthly wage over the last 12 months or their pay in a specific period. So for example, for April, you could look at last April if you wanted to, or you could simply average the pay over the last 12 months. You're not allowed to include discretionary commission, so sales commission, that sort of thing, or bonuses, but you are allowed to include additional hours or overtime that people worked over the last 12 months or in the last same pay period last year. And you are allowed to include any contractual commission or fees due. I don't know quite what they mean by fees, and no one else seems to either. So you can't include discretionary commission or bonuses, but you can include contractual commission or overtime that's been included. I'm going to talk for a minute about public funds here because there's been a lot talked about with all of this. It's not expected that furlough leave, the government says in its information on the subject, it's not expected that furlough leave is going to be used by organisations who are in receipt of public funds, which cover the wage costs of an employee. It then doesn't go on to define what public funds actually are. There's been, as I said, a lot of talk about this in HR forums. Obviously, it's intended to prevent people being furloughed whose wages are being paid from the public purse by the government. In those circumstances, employers could make a profit out of the situation. That's not what is intended here. So you wouldn't be able to furlough somebody if they are receiving, or if you are receiving for them, the money that would pay their wages. In those circumstances, it's possible and foreseeable even that the HMRC will seek to recover the furlough grant from the employer further down the line. And of course, that's what everybody's nervous about, is if I furlough people, am I going to have to pay back the grant at a later time? There will be people listening to this call, I think, who have contracts with local authorities, with the NHS, where you're delivering a contract and you're being paid for that contract from the public purse, or the money derives at somewhere along the line from the public purse, and you're using that to pay wages. And the guidance says, and I'm quoting now from the guidance, where employers receive public funding for staff costs and that funding is continuing, we expect employers to use that money to continue to pay staff in the usual fashion and correspondingly not furlough them. This also applies to non-public sector employers who receive public funding for staff costs. So it specifically says that. And I would say that a lot of you are non-public sector employers who are receiving public funding, which you are then using for staff costs. Organisations who are receiving public funding specifically to provide services to respond to COVID-19 are not expected to furlough staff. That's a bit of a given, I guess. And in a small number of cases, it then goes on to say, where organisations are not primarily funded by the government and whose staff cannot be redeployed to assist with the coronavirus response, the scheme may be appropriate for some staff. So they're trying to discourage it, aren't they? But for some of you who have who need to furlough staff, who have got no work for them, and where there isn't money coming, where perhaps they're not working on contracts or with funding that comes from the government purse, it's absolutely fine to furlough those people, and they recognise that. But what you must do is really clarify, first of all, whether your, for example, your local authority money is going to continue. We've started to hear filtering through over the past few days that people are having a dialogue with their commissioners about this, or maybe commissioners are getting, or funders are getting in touch with them and talking to them about expectations. And that's really helpful, obviously, because if people are saying, well, we're going to carry on, force majeure doesn't apply, we're expecting you to carry, we're expecting to carry on providing the money that we would ordinarily provide under this contract, even if you can't deliver it in the way that you ordinarily would, then you've still got the money coming in that you can pay people, and you wouldn't furlough people in those circumstances. Moving on to talk about the amount of time that that people can be on furlough leave for. The minimum amount of time is 3 weeks, and the longest at the moment is 3 full months, up until the 31st of May. You can bring people on and off of furlough as long as the minimum period each time is 3 weeks. And I am talking to employers every day who are actually doing that, who are rotating people in teams and saying, I'll put you on furlough for 3 weeks, and then I'll bring you back, and then I'll put the next group of people onto furlough, so that different people are effectively still at work and still running the organisation through this period. Other work. I said at the beginning of this that people can't work for you in an income generating capacity, nor can they do any service delivery for you, but they can volunteer for you as long as they're not undertaking service delivery work, and as long as they're not doing any revenue generating work. So they couldn't, for example, paint a fence. They could paint a fence for you. They could do some maintenance work on the building that you're in, for example. They can also undertake training. They can do training, they can do continuous professional development, they can complete, for example, online courses. If people are required to do that, you must make sure that their 80% furlough grant that they're getting at least covers the amount of time they spend training. In other words, that they get national minimum wage at least for the time that they spend training. In most cases, that won't be a problem, but where you've got people who are on national living wage or national minimum wage to start with, then if they are going to spend more than 80% of their normal working time actually doing online courses or training, and this might be the case with apprentices, although I don't think apprentices would usually spend a full 80% of their time training, then you need to make sure that their wages are topped up so that they earn at least the minimum wage for their age, or for the fact that they're an apprentice. They get at least the minimum wage for each of the hours that they've spent training. Okay, so in some cases where you've got minimum wage workers or apprentices doing lots of training during the time they're off, then potentially you may have to top their wages up over and above the actual furlough grant that you're paying them. Also, while we're on the subject of other work, people can work for other employers if they've already got another job, and they can be furloughed from those jobs as well. There's nothing in the guidance to stop them from getting new jobs. There's nothing to stop them from working in other jobs while they are furloughed from yours. So actually they can be furloughed from your job, and instead of that 9 to 5 Monday to Friday that they used to do, they can go out and, I don't know, be working in a field for a farmer if they want to be, or they can get an evening job delivering for Deliveroo if they want to. There's nothing to stop people from doing that. They can have second jobs, and they can volunteer for other organisations. There's lots of initiatives springing up. We've got a human lending library in Birmingham set up where people can say, I'm free to volunteer on this occasion, at this window of time. And there's lots of these sorts of charity swapping initiatives where people are swapping furloughed workers with one another to carry on getting volunteer work done in other organisations while people are furloughed from you. Because obviously they can volunteer in another organisation, and in that organisation they could do service delivery work or income generating work. They just can't do it in the organisation from which they are furloughed. When you are claiming your grant for people, employees will have to pay tax and NI, and they'll have to pay their auto-enrollment pension costs on the grant that you're giving them as normal. And you can claim back, you can calculate and claim back your employer's NI, and you can calculate and claim back the minimum auto-enrollment costs that you are making for those people as well. You can only claim back the minimum. So on actual qualifying earnings, you can't, if you pay on whole earnings, claim everything, but you can claim back the minimum pension auto-enrollment costs on qualifying earnings. And we're going to be told how you're going to be able to make that claim as part of alongside the grant. Annual leave, moving on to talk about this. So we said, didn't we, that employees remain employed throughout furlough leave, so annual leave carries on accruing. The government's been pretty silent on the treatment of this, so we've had to really work hard to interpret how this is meant to be working. ACAS finally got some guidance up about it recently, but it's been senior employment lawyers and HR professionals who've worked together to actually interpret what needs to happen with regard to annual leave, whether or not people could actually take it. So the advice now is that annual leave can be taken during furlough leave, either because the employees requested it or because you are directing them to take it. It's more likely to be the latter, because I can't imagine when people are sitting at home on 80% of their salary that you're going to be getting many requests for annual leave. But of course you will still want people to use their annual leave up so that they're not coming back to work with more annual leave than you can handle afterwards. You can direct somebody to take annual leave during furlough leave. It doesn't break furlough leave. So you can direct them to take annual leave by giving them double the amount of notice than the period of time that you want them to take. So if you want them to take a week of annual leave, you have to give them 2 weeks of notice that you want them to take the annual leave. You need to tell people what dates they will be taking annual leave on if you are directing them to take annual leave. It's no good saying, I want you to take a week of annual leave. You've got to say, we will be treating the week from X date to Y date as annual leave, and it will be deducted from your annual leave total. You may choose not to do that, and that's fine. And you may find that you may well not have a problem with accommodating annual leave at the end of the furlough leave. But the regulations will not apply. The working time regulations that say people can carry annual leave forward for up to 2 years if they can't take it will not apply to people who've been on furlough leave. That's not what it's intended for. It's intended for people who can't use annual leave because they're working so much at the moment. So if you do give people annual leave, or if they are taking annual leave during the furlough leave period, they need to be paid as though you were paying them for annual leave under the Working Time Directive, which is 100% of their salary. Remember, there is a principle in case law out there that employees can't be disincentivized from taking annual leave because they would get paid less than when they're working. So if you would ordinarily calculate their week's pay for the purposes of annual leave using, for example, overtime, then you would still need to include that in your calculation for the payment of annual leave while they're on furlough leave. But you will be able to claim back 80% of what you pay them. You'll be able to still put the furlough leave grant in for the time that they're on annual leave. Recognising that the calculation of wage for annual leave and the calculation of what you can claim for them under furlough leave will be done a little bit differently, depending upon what you have to include for annual leave and what furlough leave allows you to include in it. But if it were me, I would still be wanting people to be using up their annual leave while they're on furlough leave, in order that you haven't got the problem of how to deal with it afterwards. If people are on maternity leave or if they're on sick leave, those regimes are not changing. Maternity, paternity, adoption, shared parental leave, all of that is still the same. It's calculated in the same way, and it is paid to people in the same way. So furlough leave doesn't improve or alter maternity leave. Yes, people would get more money if they were on furlough, but actually if they've notified you that they're going on maternity leave, then actually they get what they would ordinarily get on maternity leave. We're told, and I've not seen any further detail on this yet, that if you pay people more during maternity, paternity, adoption, if you have a contractual element to that pay over and above the statutory level, then you're going to be able to claim for that through the furlough grant. Don't know anything more about that at the moment, but that's good news. That's good news, isn't it? And again, if people are sick during furlough leave and they get statutory sick pay, then you wouldn't claim furlough grant for that period of time. They can't be claiming, you can't be getting two lots of money from the government for them. So they can't be getting statutory sick pay or statutory maternity pay and furlough grant at the same time. Okay, that's lots of information, isn't it? A final slide, and then we're going to move on to some questions and answers. So just in terms of how you go about actually furloughing people, a lot of you will have done this already. Remember, it's a contractual variation. It's not just taking away 20% of someone's pay. It's actually removing work that creates the contractual variation. And then obviously some people are paying 100% and some people are taking 20% of pay away. So it's 80%. So seek agreement with people. It doesn't have to be done in any very formal way at all. It's quite possible to simply have a conversation with someone or to send them an email and to gain their agreement in a very casual kind of way and then to confirm that decision in writing. HMRC recently published some updated guidance that said you must record the agreement in writing and you must keep it for 5 years. Why 5 years? I don't know. Nothing else that I'm aware of is kept for 5 years in employment law or through HMRC, but they want you to keep this written agreement for 5 years. So I suggest you do it. Remember, when you're placing people on furlough leave, equality legislation still applies. So how you go about selecting people for furlough leave really matters. I've been talking to people that have been saying to me things like that they want to select someone for furlough leave because it's the person that's always off sick, or because it's the person that's got a disability and they should be at home shielding, shouldn't they? Those are not reasons, those are not valid reasons on their own to select people for furlough leave. You have to remember that those could be discriminatory or found to be discriminatory further down the line. So it's important to remember that Equality Act 2010 will continue to apply to these sorts of business decisions that you're making. If you've got more than 20 staff involved in one establishment, you may find that, and particularly if you are in a unionised environment, an environment that recognises a union, you may find that you need to do a collective consultation, depending upon what your recognition agreement says. What we would say to you in these circumstances, clearly you don't want to be going through collective consultation that might be 30 days or 45 days, depending upon how many people you've got to consult. I would still seek agreement where you can and deal only with the people that object through consultation. And remember that the alternative to furlough leave is redundancy, which actually, you know, if you've got the alternative of being at home on some pay compared to being made redundant, it's for most people going to be an attractive option. One final point is that if you've already taken action, I talked earlier about people that might have put people on layoff or short-time working, or people who have actually made people redundant already. Where you've already taken action, claims can be backdated to the 1st of March. So the scheme can therefore cover employees who have been made redundant since the 28th of February if they're rehired by the employer. No one is saying that you have to do that, but the flexibility is there for you to do it if you want to. Again, equality legislation will apply, so if you're going to do it, I'd suggest you are consistent in how you apply it. It can also cover people who are on unpaid leave. So if you've put some people on unpaid leave since the 28th of February, actually you'll be able to go back to the day that you started their furlough, their unpaid leave from, and you'll be able to claim furlough grant for them from that time. You can otherwise only claim your furlough leave from the point at which you agree the variation with people. So if you haven't furloughed people yet, if you haven't got your furlough leave agreement in place, they're not furloughed, and you will technically not be able to claim for them. You might say, well, we had a verbal arrangement on the 23rd of March. This was the case. Okay, then, if that's what you did, I'd get a contract in place really quickly that reflects that. But you can go backwards. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can go backwards for people that you had already taken action with prior to the furlough leave being introduced, as long as they were on your payroll on the 28th of February 2020. That's a lot of information, and I've seen the questions coming in while I've been talking to you. Before we go into the questions, I just want to draw your attention here to Roots HR's contact details. So Roots HR, we use our trading surpluses to provide a 1 hour free consultancy service to any charity or not-for-profit organisation. And most of you on this call are going to be beneficiaries of the Lloyds Bank Foundation grants, and therefore have access to the Enhance programme, which gives you access to consultants like us as well. If you come to us for questions after this webinar, and we've currently got 27 of you with questions, so we might not get through all of those right now. I'm going to do my best, but we might not get through them all. In the event that you come to us with questions after this, we're open Monday to Friday, 8:30 till 5 p.m. It's Charlotte that will receive your email or who will answer your phone call. You can contact us on 01562 840060 or hello@rootshr.org.uk, and you will be able to get free consultancy services up to 1 hour. This is a once in a lifetime thing. It's not something we do every year. So your organisation can come once in its lifetime to do this. And we offer that advice in 15-minute periods. So you can come up to 4 times with your hour, depending upon how long it takes us to deal with your questions. And we'll be very pleased to help you. Beyond that window of time, there may well be some support that's available to you through hours that Lloyds Bank Foundation pays for us as well. And you'd have to go through your grant manager to be able to access that. So if you've used all of your 1 hour free with us, go to your Lloyds Bank, and we'll tell you when that's the case, go to your Lloyds Bank Foundation grant manager and they will have recourse to some hours that Lloyds Bank Foundation have already paid for people to come for. So, Charlotte, I'm going to ask you to go through the questions one by one. It might sometimes be helpful to group these together if there's some recurrent themes rather than straightforward 1 to 27.
Okay.
And just so people know, I'm going to be okay for about another half an hour. So in the event that, I'm not going to be dropping off just because we've got to 11 o'clock, feel free to keep questions coming through if you want to, and I'll let you know when we're going to have to close down. All right.
Should we start with the furlough questions?
If you like, yes. Are there any non-furlough questions?
Yeah, we've got a couple. Do you want those?
Yeah, let's do them first. Yeah.
Okay. So if someone is working on a non-CV related job and they don't book leave this year, are they entitled to carry forward?
No. And in fact, it is your duty as their employer to make sure that they do book leave. You would be expected in those circumstances to direct them to take leave. They have to take a minimum of the 20 days out of the statutory 28 days per year, and you have to direct them to take that. You have to make sure they take it as their employer. It is your duty to make sure that that happens under the Working Time Directive.
Thank you. And are there any tips for data protection with papers / laptops when home working? And what
are there any what, sorry?
Are there any tips for data protection at home with papers and laptops, and any reasonable measures in a busy home environment?
I know, it is difficult, isn't it? I think if you've got people that have got to have paperwork at home, you need to provide them with a lockable cabinet. Get a lockable filing cabinet or a cabinet of some description on order. If it's got to be in hard copy, that they're holding documentation, I would say that's important. And I would also send some written guidance out to people, hold a webinar or a conference call with your team and talk through what you expect of them in respect of data and documents during this period of time. Raise their awareness of what you expect. It will be different for different organisations, because you'll have different data needs, different scenarios. That scenario I talked to you about me giving advice to somebody about someone else's probation period, wouldn't happen in lots of organisations. It wouldn't be relevant, but you know, it also could. It could also happen in lots of other ones. So those two things would be the two things I would say. Give people lockable cabinets to use and to keep at home and to use for you if they've got to have hard copy, and write down what your rules are around data protection, and have a conference call with people and get line managers in their check-in calls to be saying, have you read the rules around data protection? Are there any problems for you? What environment are you in? What room are you in? And what can you do? So for example, if a lot of your work is done on a laptop and you're just typing away, you can talk about shielding that, you know, things like having a, just minimizing the screen if somebody comes alongside. But also at the same time, you can talk about the fact that, for example, they can they need to not be downloading data onto home computers, for example, unless that's the way that you've got them working. If you've got them working on home computers, then you need some kind of deletion regime, some kind of uploading it back up to the server, some kind of deletion regime. Those are the sorts of things that line managers can talk through to make sure that it's really clear to people how best they can protect data in their circumstances. Okay.
Okay. Is there a contact or a link for the volunteer swap scheme that you mentioned?
I haven't got it to hand, but if you put into Google Human Lending Library, you'll get that one. You'll get the Birmingham one. I don't have one to hand.
And shall we move on to the furlough questions then? So
Okay.
we've got one here. Would an employee facing redundancy for non-corona reasons, i.e. restructuring, be eligible for the furloughing scheme?
Yeah, they are. If that helps you to get through this period, and if you, because I've got clients I've been advising where they were making redundancies anyway already at this time of year, you know, start the new financial year and so on. For some of those people, we've just carried on because there is no hope. Their business model doesn't work and there is no hope. We're just going to carry on with the redundancies because coronavirus neither improves or alters the scenario in any way, shape or form. With other situations, coronavirus creates a degree of uncertainty about whether or not the redundancy is actually still needed. And so for those people, we have definitely furloughed them. So yes, you can. And it just defers decision. And in some cases, it will be a kinder way of dealing with things because clearly people have got an income coming in during the furlough period, and then and you may still have to make them redundant at the end. Of course you may, and the government legislation, the scheme recognises there will still be redundancies in some cases at the end, but at least people have had some income during the furlough period.
A little bit of information here from Lisa. She said the lottery are classed as public funds. If projects can't carry on, they're allowing them to be paused and the funding used later so staff can be furloughed.
Yes, yes they are. I heard that, and I've heard in a lot of cases that they're not pausing them as well. So generally I think with the big lottery fund, it is business as usual where they can, but I think that they are pausing contracts to allow for furloughing to take place. In some cases. Thank you, Lisa.
And then we've got one here from Marcus. On the BWB seminar, they suggested that if public sector contracts / grants do not mention payment for specific staff and you are still providing the service, albeit differently, then you can furlough staff.
I understand, and I listened to that as well. I think the problem is we don't know what you would be relying on something that we don't know if the government accepts. It's one person's interpretation of how the grant will work, and I completely agree. I would probably run a similar argument myself in those circumstances, but I can't. It's not in the guidance from the government, and we haven't seen it anywhere from them so we don't know. We just don't know whether you will be able to keep a grant in those circumstances further down the line were it to be examined or scrutinised. that's what you'd be relying on, though, is that you'd be relying on the fact that you're being paid to deliver the contract. You're not being paid the staff wages. You choose to pay staff wages as an output of that contract.
We've got another furlough question. So did I hear correctly that the gross monthly pay limit on which to base the 80% furlough pay is 3,125? I had read that the 2,500 was the gross maximum.
No, apparently not. The the gross maximum is 3,125, and that means that the maximum grant claimable is 2,500, and that is in the guidance somewhere. I saw it with my own eyes because I didn't realise it until then either.
I think that's it for the questions then. We've just had a comment from Paul to say Lottery have confirmed their funding isn't being treated as public funding.
Ah, interesting. That's very helpful for you then, isn't it? Really, really helpful. I would wait if I was receiving funding from the big lottery. I would wait to receive my confirmation from them directly myself to act on that. But that's good. That's helpful. I've got in the corner of my screen, Charlotte, I've got 33 somethings going on, or 33 or 34 chats up there.
Yep.
Are those questions that we haven't seen, or are they?
No, we've been through all of those now.
Lovely. Okay. Anyone? Far fewer questions than I thought. Then, anyone got any more questions before we wind up? Anything else coming through?
Nothing at the moment. No, I think
okay.
That's it for the questions.
Any questions that you think grantees might be particularly? Can we bring you back in, Helen? Can we ask you to unmute?
Hi there.
Is there anything in particular that you think grantees ought to be aware of as a result of anything I've said this morning?
I don't think so. I think that was hugely helpful and was loads of information. I'm guessing if people have individual questions, they can get in touch with you, but I think that covered brilliantly. So thanks, Jan.
Okay.
Brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much, everyone who's joined us, and for those who have stayed on to the end. That was really interesting, and thanks for delivering that for us. As I mentioned at the start, we will be sharing the recording afterwards with you, and we'll also share Roots HR's details and any other information that links and things that were shared on the chat. Just to let you know, this is just one in a series of webinars we've been delivering. So we've done 2 webinars on communicating in a crisis and also another on digital fundraising. So you can find those on our website, and we're looking to host more over the coming weeks. So when you leave this webinar, you'll be shown a quick survey. It's just 3 questions, but that will really help us if you can fill that in around what might be useful next during this crisis if we were to put on more webinars. I think that's everything from me. Just a big thank you to Jan and Charlotte for taking the time to deliver that for us this morning. And also, I hope you have a lovely Easter break, everyone, and for the charities still with us, thank you so much for everything you're doing during this really difficult time and how you're supporting people. But yeah, that's everything from me. So unless there's anything else from you, Jan and Charlotte, I think we'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.